Everyone, this is Paige Garvin from Jennifer Schaus and Associates. We are coming to you live from Washington, D.C. today. Thank you for joining us in a sponsored content webinar. Our webinar is brought to you today by ELINT Capital. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be sent out within 24 hours. You can also find our 800 plus government contracting videos on our YouTube channel. They are all complimentary. And lastly, please post any questions in the question box in your control panel and not in the chat box. We are excited to have you here for Federal Contracting Pitfalls, the invoice you shouldn't have submitted yet. Today, we're digging into the invoicing errors that quietly slow down government payment, trigger disputes, or create audit risk. And more importantly, how to catch and avoid them before they cost you time or money. Joining me to walk through this are Charlie Newmark, founder and CEO of ELINT Capital, and Eric Rabinovich, head of GovCon and managing director at X-Caliber GovCon Capital. With that, I'll hand it over to Charlie to get us started.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where on the planet you are, or maybe good evening. I'm Charlie Newmark, founder of ELINT Capital. On previous webinars, which can be found on YouTube, I talk about how the company started, the founding of it, the reason for it, the reason I built it. So if you're interested in hearing that, I invite you to go. It's at the beginning of some of the earlier webinars, which can be found on our YouTube channel. But essentially, we built the company around helping government contractors win more contracts, stay in compliance, and prevent cash flow problems, and also ultimately help them grow. So we focus on high growth government contracting firms that need capital and support with, like I said, compliance and back office stuff. Part of our technology obviously is needed money to lend, so we partnered with X-Caliber Capital. Eric Rabinovich is here from X-Caliber, who's an expert in GovCon everything, the GovCon expert, I call him, and he's going to speak to you in a minute. I'll let him introduce himself. But again, I just thank you all for being here, and we'll get the webinar started. Okay, so over to you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. Appreciate it. So quick background on me. Sat on three sides of the table, depending on how many sides the table has. But I've been a government contractor, worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers prior to their spinoff into Guidehouse, what is now known as Guidehouse. After that, I worked as a contracting officer at the Food and Drug Administration. And so have a lot of experience directly with reviewing and processing and approving invoices and working with my stakeholders on the program side, the cores, the COTARs, et cetera. And then most recently on the lending side to government contractors and helping them with ensuring they have access to capital so they can continue to grow, continue to perform, as Charlie mentioned. So we're happy to be here. What we're going to be talking about today is about invoices. So specifically the ones that don't come back because there's a field completed incorrectly or not at all. We're going to talk through some of the common pitfalls we've seen. I do want to, before we dive into it, I do want to go through one disclaimer, which is that, and this goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Obviously, the government is not one monolithic entity, right? So the government is made up of a whole patchwork of disparate agencies and departments and missions. And so we're going to be talking in generalities today, but I do want to just fully concede up front that you'll probably hear certain things that we say that I bring up that may run counter to your experiences, that might not necessarily line up with your experience. And I'm really, what we've tried to do today is not go through literally every possible permutation of what an invoicing snag looks like. It's really going through some of the cornerstones of what the FAR says that, how invoices have to be processed, what the common examples are that we've seen in practice through our lived experience. So, we're trying not to make sweeping generalizations here, but, a lot of this is going to be partly informed by what we've seen and then also balanced against what the actual rules are. But just take some of what you hear today with a grain of salt. Keep in mind that one department, one agency is subject to, one FAR supplement, and those could deviate from what, you're seeing as a contractor at another department and agency where there's a different FAR supplement and different local policies and procedures that are being adhered to. So, there's a lot of diversity in the context of the fact that there's one FAR, but of course there's many different agencies and different interpretations of rules and different contracting officers' preferences. So just want to give that disclaimer before we get into it. But with that being said, let's talk about why an invoice and start with why an invoice can still get rejected. So I want to start with the fact that there's an actual defined term in the FAR for what proper is, and it's not. I mean, it can sometimes be subjective, but it is a defined term. And so my point is that if you look at it through the lens of a contracting officer reading an invoice or receiving an invoice for the first time, it really is binary, right? Every field's there or it's not. And so if the invoice is improper, there's not partial credit. And so practically what that means is an improper invoice, it's not sitting in a queue waiting to get reviewed. It gets rejected. And for anyone who's gone through this, what they'll likely tell you is that 30, like if you're trying to get paid on that Prompt Payment Act basis and try to get that payment in 30 days, that clock starts over. It's not usually something where if you got word back after you submitted an invoice, let's say 15 days later, you hear back, hey, we just realized, you didn't include the correct period of performance. We're in the next option year now, and the period of performance that's on the invoice is wrong. You didn't update it from last year. That can start the clock all over again. So it's not going to be 44 or 45 days. It'll be another 30-day clock. So it can be, time consuming and costly to make these mistakes, or if you have an oversight. Again, there can be exceptions to this. Government might be graceful in a particular example or move fast. But in terms of what we've seen, the clock can start all over again and you're back at zero. And so I can share, when I was a contracting officer, I returned invoices for a single missing field. And a lot of the times it's not because I was feeling grouchy that day or because I wanted to. It's because I had to, based off the rules I was paid to follow. And so because the payment office literally can't process that invoice. So, it wasn't personal. It's not a judgment about the contractor, but obviously it had implications and real world impacts for the firm on the other side of that invoice. Secondly, the other thing I want to cut out or emphasize, and it cuts the other way, is that the government has typically 7 days to return an improper invoice. And if they sit past that 7-day mark, the payment clock can run. So I think knowing specifically what those rules are, and again, make sure you're reading not just the FAR, but if there's a supplement for the department that you have a contract with, you want to read that, and even potential local policies that are even more detailed than what you might see in the supplement. You'll usually see those details in the contract. A well-written contract should have a whole host of clauses around invoicing and making sure you read that stuff. It is fine print, but it's also what comes into play and what the rules are going to be that apply when you might be dealing with a conflict or some kind of invoicing issue. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so this slide is the title of the webinar, and I'll tell you why. So basically, some costs can't be billed until the government actually gives you the approval first in writing. And I would say the most common one is subcontractor costs. This would be under FAR 52.244-2. And if you're under a cost reimbursement contract, or T&M or labor hour, or you're placing a large fixed price contract, typically the contracting officer's advance written consent is going to be required before the subcontract is finalized. And that can happen during discussions and negotiations. But one of the traps that we've seen in this particular context is there's a mistake that can happen at contract mobilization where months before the invoice even is generated and submitted, by the time you're drafting that first bill, it might be too late to fix it cleanly. And so if you do bill it anyways, the claim could be improper once you submit it. And so the practical solution, it shouldn't take a ton of time, but essentially at contract kickoff, look at which clause is going to apply from your award. So I mentioned 52.244-2, that's just an example, but take a look at that and see which of your subs listed need consent. And then you get the consent early in writing. And then if you're wondering why primes never have to do this, usually it's because they have an approved purchasing system where individual consent is waived. A lot of small businesses we work with, they're not dealing with these, massive multi-million-dollar platforms, and it's a lot more manual. So the clause can apply with full force, and it's just something you want to be aware of. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, so here's an example of a timeline for having one line item incorrect on a contract. So let's say you submit the invoice, that's day 0. Let's say you hear back day 6. If you resubmit that same day, the payment could land by day 36, ideally. But if it slips into day 7, and depending on how strict that contracting officer is and how they are with following the rules that they're adhering to, I mentioned this on the first slide once we got started, they only have 7 days to respond. And so if they wait too long, that could work in your favor. But the other thing that I want to bring up here is, in a perfect world, you don't want to be in a situation where you're getting into a back and forth and turning a potential administrative mix up into like a antagonistic dialogue. And it can be stressful, right? Every vendor wants to get paid as fast as possible. I think contracting officers don't want things languishing on their desk, and they don't want to deal or feel like they're holding up payment. And there have been times where there can be legitimate tension and frustration, and you don't want that to spill over and potentially compromise the relationship between yourself and your customer. But of course, you want to get paid, and you want to make sure if there's an invoice issue that it's given attention and it's adjudicated. The reason a wrong CLIN could potentially kill that whole invoice instead of just annoying someone is because the payment office validates that invoice against the funds obligated. They look at the specific line item. And so money sitting on, say, CLIN 2 cannot pay an invoice that you issued perhaps against CLIN 1. And small mix-ups like these, they can reset the clock, force you to have to resubmit, fix the invoice. So even if the overall contract has plenty of funding, it's not a typo problem. It's a funds matching and invoice validation problem. So the fix obviously can sound boring, but it works. And that's essentially whoever's reviewing the invoice, you check it against the current and most recent contract mod, the actual funding table that's in effect, and not necessarily against last month's invoice. And frankly, last month's invoice could be where the issue started. I see this a lot in cases where we're in a new option period. And so it's not common. You just look at the last invoice, you pull it up, you start, keying certain things into the next month. But if that next month is the start of the next option year, and you have to update more than just the invoice amount, it's easy to see how some of these things fall through the crack. So just to go through one example. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is a little different from some of the other points I'm making today, which is that if nothing bounces and the invoice gets paid, you might think that that's great. That's the whole point of what we're talking about. What's the issue? Well, what we wanted to highlight here is something doesn't apply in every contract, but for those where there's provisional rates that get approved, when you bill indirect costs, you bill at a provisional rate. So it's essentially an estimate that you've agreed on with the government. In the example you see here, 32%. After year end, there's typically actuals that come in, and then there's a final rate. And let's say that final rate is 35%. That 3-point gap, it didn't go anywhere. It basically accrued over time silently on every invoice that you've submitted all year, and then it lands as one number in closeout. And so essentially when that contract review is done and there's nothing left to absorb it against, that can cause some issues, and you might have an unexpected surprise in terms of contract closeout and having to essentially negotiate a payout with the government where if you ended up billing having a higher rate than what you were billing for, you could run into some issues and potentially even have to eat some costs. So, and it cuts both ways. If the final rate comes in, above, you could potentially ask for, or sorry, below, you might owe money back. You could ask for money in the opposite. It really depends, but the practical solution, that the habit that we recommend folks consider adding to their financial processes, is to compare the actual rate to the provisional rate at least quarterly. And it's your own accounting data. You don't need to ask for permission to do this. If you're working with a government contract expert in the accounting space, there's a lot of CPAs and bookkeeping and accounting firms that are specifically geared towards government contractors. They understand DCAA. They understand what we're talking about in terms of provisional rates. So, whether it's you or a trusted advisor, but, looking at this stuff at least quarterly, we think it's the bare minimum. And so if you're drafting more than a point or two, I would ask the contracting officer or your ACO for a mid-year provisional rate adjustment. It's okay. Things change. Assumptions sometimes aren't exactly accurate. That's allowed. You just, if you're not communicating and you don't bring it up until contract closeout or at the end of the contract, that is not ideal. And so almost nobody asks, in our opinion. I think a lot of times we get told they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to upset the contracting officer, but that's their job, and this is your job as a steward of taxpayer funds, to be on top of your contract finances. And there's nothing wrong with raising your hand and saying, look, here were the assumptions that we had at the time that we were submitting our bid, and here are the realities on the ground, and they're slightly different. If you're honest and respectful and professional about it, usually it's not an issue. So that's another big thing that we wanted to highlight. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so subcontractor costs are one of the most common sources of invoice disputes. And the reason is basically they're the easiest numbers to bill ahead of when you actually incur them. So your sub hasn't invoiced you yet. Your month is closing, so maybe you bill an estimate. We see that often enough. If you look at the numbers on the slide, let's say the progress report puts you at 284,500. Invoices for a little higher than that, 301,000 and change. So that's about just under a $17,000 gap. Well, here's the point. The gap isn't the problem. It's the documented mismatch. And so if the progress report and your invoice both live in the government's file and they disagree, the contracting officer doesn't have to prove anything. The discrepancy is there for everyone to see. And then what that can trigger is actually worse than just one return invoice. It can actually be, it can be the contracting officer starting to require subcontractor level cost detail before accepting any billed subcosts going forward. I wouldn't say this is super common, but I've seen it happen enough where I think it's worth bringing up and sharing. And so if you've just added a review layer now to every future invoice, it's probably something you'd like to avoid doing. So like the general rule of thumb I recommend to clients we chat with and work with is build the actual sub invoices that you have in hand. And then if you genuinely do have to bill estimates, have a written reconciliation step. And so when a true up happens, it looks like it's just part of the process. And oftentimes I've seen the government be okay with making an adjustment on the next month invoice. Let's say it's a firm fixed price or you're billing, equal installments. So again, this is just another example where the details are going to be dependent on your specific contract, your specific customer, their policies. But some of these examples hopefully give some, share some insights just in terms of what we've seen and what you might want to avoid as you work through your invoicing with your various customers. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so 3 invoices here. And you can see there's unsupported travel. So that's for 2,400. It's an entertainment cost, flat out unallowable in the FAR. 1,100, a cost that is above an approved ceiling. And so, these might seem small and insignificant, but again, from a couple of examples we've seen here, this isn't necessarily something that you can simply fix and forget. And to my earlier point on the previous slide, the government doesn't get to forget. And so disallowed costs can get tracked cumulatively for the life of the contract. And then they're not necessarily going to just be separate events in the file. It can actually be a pattern that the government recognizes. And then a pattern is really exactly what changes the audit risk or the audit profile that you might not even realize you're subject to. So when an incurred cost audit comes around, a few small disallowances can tell the auditor that it's possible your cost screening is weak. And then they pull on that thread. And so there's a lot of risk some folks don't realize hides underneath the surface level of some of these contracts, even if the line items are small. Now, that doesn't mean the risk is very likely to translate into a full-blown audit or to result in some kind of penalties or remediation steps, but it's something you should take as a cautionary tale where these stories are not meant to instill fear or impugn the government. We're truly just sharing certain things we've seen and working backwards from what can you look out for, what are some of the risk factors out there, and then more importantly, what can you do to avoid it. And so in this case, the fix becomes something that's a little bit further upstream of billing entirely, which is essentially we would recommend you flag unallowable costs in your accounting system when the cost is entered and not when you're drafting the invoice, and review those costs. And then by the time billing comes around and you're actually generating that invoice, it should already be impossible for something like entertainment to end up on a government invoice. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so everything we've covered today, the missing fields, the consent gap, if you go back to the subcontractor example, the wrong CLIN, the rate drift, reconciliation mismatches. So those generally get caught by the same 4 habits. And so we want you to notice what's not on the slide. It's not software, there's not headcount, there's not consultants, although not saying those things can't help here. They definitely can, but it's really a checklist. So we want everyone to review the same way every time instead of improvising it. So you have a second reviewer who didn't draft the invoice. The drafter shouldn't be able to see their own error. Right? That's part of the issue here. So, and that's it's easier said than done. I know it's difficult if you're a really small business and you have to wear a lot of hats. It's normal to go through those growing pains and get to a point where you actually can have a specialized team in place. But nonetheless, we recommend being able to, if you can, bifurcate the role of entering the invoices versus reviewing them. Documentation should be assembled before drafting. So you shouldn't scramble it together reactively after an invoice comes back or gets rejected. And then the one that a lot of firms skip, log the rejections. It's kind of like an AAR, an after action report, but with a finance spin on it, where if you're not learning from these mistakes, they're going to happen eventually. If you're going to be in the industry long enough, if you work on enough contracts, you're going to run into some kind of invoicing issues. And as with any issue you run into for the business, you should be cataloging those and reviewing them regularly. Not because you're a glutton for punishment and you want to keep reliving the mistakes. It's because you want to learn from them and make sure that you don't do the same things moving forward that led to those mistakes in the first place. And that's the essence of it. So I would say if I could give only one of the four, it's that log. It's really making sure that you've learned from those mistakes, you've changed and improved the processes so that that doesn't happen in the future. Most firms fix the bounced invoice, they resubmit it, they move on. But if that same error comes back 6 invoices later because nobody wrote down why it happened and then made those changes, that's obviously that's something that you can avoid, and that doesn't have an excuse if it keeps repeating. So that's the whole system. We can go to the next slide. All right, so if you look at the left column here, every one of those is a timing issue. And so it's not a competence issue. These are contractors. These contractors, they do the work generally fine. It's not that's not the issue. But they find out about the wrong CLIN. When the invoice bounces, they find out about consent at billing. They find out about the rate drift at closeout. Right? These are all reactive or some form of reactive types of contractors where you're kind of just waiting for problems to come up and then you're reacting to them and doing your best to get through it. On the right side, it's the same contractor doing some of these checks that we've talked about and doing them earlier in the process. So before submission instead of after rejection, before contract mobilization instead of at billing, quarterly instead of year end or contract closeout. So I would say if you walk away from today remembering one thing, it's move the check and review process earlier. That's the entire webinar. All right, last slide. So the last thing here we wanted to emphasize is, and I'll keep it short, even a perfect process doesn't completely eliminate issues or get you to zero in terms of invoicing friction or problems with getting an invoice reviewed and approved. A payment office makes mistakes sometimes. A dispute takes time to resolve. Sometimes if you're waiting on the program office to mark something received, they might make a mistake as well, and then that has a downstream effect with respect to the payment office processing it. And so these things do happen, and so payroll doesn't wait for resubmission. And so that is the gap that both us at X-Caliber and ELINT, that's the gap that we've built, the product that we offer to solve that gap. So working capital sized against your awarded contract value, aligned to your delivery and billing schedule. And so an invoicing issue stays an administrative problem instead of becoming a true cash problem and putting the business in at risk of performance failure. So there's no balance sheet lending requirement. If that's relevant to wherever you are today, we'd love for you to reach out. Contact info is on the screen. We're happy to take questions, and we're going to keep it short and sweet today.
Thank you, Eric. I told you all he is the leading expert. I had nothing to say there, nothing to add. So thank you for that, Eric. And as Eric said, you can find us elintcapital.com. You could plug in your UEI. It'll tell you how much you actually can qualify for. As he said, it's based on your contract backlog, not your balance sheet. So we can give you a real-time answer to that. And then you could reach out to us also via email at info@elintcapital.com. But I'll open it up now, like Eric said, to any questions.
Couple of questions came through. The first one is, if an invoice is just missing one field, does the whole invoice get rejected, or can the government just ask for that one field to be fixed?
So two parts to this. One is the disclaimer I gave earlier in terms of there's going to be differences in terms of how this specific example might be handled between different government agencies and even sometimes different contracting officers. So, take that as sort of the broad disclaimer now for this question and for the whole presentation, but more specifically, formally, it should get returned. So there's no partial fix mechanism in the regulation, at least. Improper is improper. It's really, if you read it literally, it's binary. So the whole invoice will come back. And then I'd say in practice, some payment office analysts might pick up the phone and just say, hey, you're missing the period of performance. There are degrees of formality. It's not uniform across the government. So I've seen plenty of cases, and I was the contracting officer in plenty of cases where I just picked up the phone and told the vendor, hey, I don't know if you noticed this, but you got to fix the dates, or you're referencing the wrong CLIN or option period, whatever it is. So it will depend, but I don't want to sugarcoat it. I've seen contracting officers and agencies be very strict about this stuff, and it's not a negotiation. It's not an exchange of opinions. It's this is wrong, this is rejected, and that's the end of it, and now you have to start the process over. So I hate to give an it depends answer, because I, like many people, value and appreciate certainty, but this one is one where it really will depend on the specific contract, the customer, the agency, and even the contracting officer and the support team around him or her.
Thank you for that. The next question is, who absorbs the true-up gap if the contractor's already been paid at the provisional rate all year? Is that money that the contractor then owes back?
Well, so it is going to depend on the direction. So if the final rate comes in higher than the provisional rate, so the example I gave earlier, I believe we had 32, that then provisionally it was 32%, and then that it was 35. So in that example, the government would actually owe you, and you can invoice the difference at closeout. But assuming there's a ceiling and funding left on the contract, that there are other implications or other factors that come into play there. If the final rate comes in lower than the provisional rate, then yeah, you were overpaid all year on paper, and that's money you would technically owe back. And it's exactly why you want to watch it earlier in quarter. We said quarterly, but the sooner you're able to get in front of that, the more likely you can take action and fix it and get things aligned.
Okay. As a small business, how likely am I to actually face an incurred cost audit?
I would say it depends on the nature of the contracts you've been awarded. So, if you're doing like developmental medical research where a lot of these are cost reimbursement, cost plus fixed fee, it's not a small likelihood. I mean, these are more complex. I mean, frankly, you're going to be subject to a lot more scrutiny upfront, even before the contract is awarded. But if we're talking about, like a GSA awarded, FAR part, like a multiple award schedule task order, or a simplified acquisition, yeah, in those cases, I don't expect there to be much of any risk there, unless something truly egregious surfaces. But again, this is one of those cases where if the nature of the work is inherently more complex because it's a complex contract type, yeah, the risk is elevated in those cases.
And it looks like this is our last question. If a rejected invoice creates a cash flow gap, how fast can financing like ELINT Capital provides be put in place? Is it something that they'd need to set up in advance, or can they access it quickly when the dispute happens?
In advance, I would start there, full stop, in advance, but underwriting is going to key off your actual contracts. Also, the billing history, your systems, and that does take time to stand up. So I would say the middle of a payment dispute is probably the worst possible moment to start that process, just because now you're negotiating under pressure. Obviously, you can't necessarily anticipate when something like that is going to happen, but I'd say the way it's designed to work is the facility gets stood up when things are calm. Now, I want to draw a distinction between calm in terms of there not being an active invoice dispute versus the calm of having to like ramp up a new contract. Obviously, that's probably anything but calm, but that's what I mean. If you're in the height or heat of an invoicing dispute, there can be some complexities with that. But in any case, the point is to get that facility stood up and have it, sit there where it's not costing you anything while you're not using it. And then the day that an invoice bounces, okay, and maybe you were expecting that payment within a certain time frame, then if need be, you can draw against that work that you've already performed. And you can almost think about it from the context of like bonding capacity. So you don't go and get that the day you need it, but you have it so that, if that bad day comes, it's, more of an inconvenience than a crisis. Or I should say insurance, not bonding.
All right, thank you very much for that. That was our last question. Thank you for the webinar. Thank you to all of our attendees. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We would love to hear from you. You can see our contact information here, and an email will go out with it after the webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Madison. Thank you, everyone, for joining.